And at the end of the day, becoming an enterprise architect requires this key mindset shift. You are no longer building systems. You are shaping how your organization evolves over time. There is no single perfect way to organize these architecture roles within an organization.
Not every organization has the luxury of a fully staffed architecture team.
It all depends on how the organization tries to position the architecture capability and what they expect from this architecture capability.
I always say that anyone can understand the framework, anyone can understand the knowledge in general, but there are some other aspects that cannot be taught in frameworks or books.
I believe that every organization, regardless of its size or industry, should have at least one enterprise architect and one solution architect on staff.
Being an effective enterprise architect doesn't just mean writing frameworks or understanding frameworks only.
There is this shift from being a problem solver to becoming a navigator.
Welcome back to another episode of the EA Explain series. By now, you have probably noticed that enterprise architecture is not just about frameworks. It's also about people. Like we discussed in the last episode, people matters a lot. The roles architects play, the responsibilities they carry, and how they collaborate together to drive change. In this episode, we will explore the different architecture roles that exist within the organization and how they differ and adapt depending on the context. And of course, I'm joined again by Jager to help us unpack the differences and the real-world dynamics behind these titles. Welcome back, Eric.
Thank you, Omar. It's great to be here again. And like always, I'm looking forward to delivering yet another insightful video.
Thank you so much. Excited to discuss the people side of the architecture?
Let's do this.
Well, let's begin by mapping the landscape. Because once we mention the word architects, that title means different things in different places. So just to set the stage, what are the primary roles involved in architecture within an organization and how they are typically structured in general?
Yes, I think that before answering this question, I think it would be wise for me to clarify that there is no single perfect way to organize these architecture roles within an organization, because many factors actually influence this decision, including, for example, the organization's size, but also the maturity of the architecture capability and even the industry in which the organization operates. And I think that all these factors play a role in determining which architecture roles are necessary or even desirable. So if you look at what I've written down in my book, Getting Started with Enterprise Architecture, I generally follow the guidelines that are established by the Jager standard. And that framework defines 3 core architecture roles. So first, there is the role of the enterprise architect, right? Which in some cases is even divided into a chief architect and enterprise architect role, with the chief architect being a specialization of the enterprise architect role. And then there is the role of the segment architect, or formerly known as the domain architect. And last but not least, the solution architect. Now, many additional specializations have emerged from these core architecture roles over the years. Consider, for example, the roles of the business architect or the cloud architect, network architect, all examples of these specializations. And I think it's important to note that these are actually, and I can't mention this enough, specializations of the core architecture roles. They're not roles on their own. So for instance, the business architect role is a specialization of the segment architect role, while the cloud and network architect roles are specializations of the solution architect role. Now, you might be wondering why these last two, the cloud and network architects, are not specializations of the segment architect role. But this generic role covers the technical architecture domain. And you could argue, of course, that cloud and network are part of this technology domain. Now, of course, it is correct and actually directly answers the question of why these 2 roles are not specializations of the segment architect role. Now, as I mentioned earlier, cloud and network are part of the technology domain, with the word part being the key word here. Now, a business architect, on the other hand, covers the entire business domain. An application or information architect covers the entire application or information domain. But if you look at cloud and network architects, they cover a part of the technology domain. And therefore, there are specializations of the solution architect role, focusing on a specific area within a domain.
Well, I think that creates the big picture view, highlighting the typical roles of architecture from solution to domain to enterprise levels. But also, I think this is where the confusion often begins, especially in growing organizations. So, to make it more clear, I would like to clarify the scope and prevent role overlap or misunderstanding in multidisciplinary teams. Because as we often see in hiring posts, they post, for example, EA with mandatory technical coding skills, where they still name it as enterprise architect or chief architect. So my question is, what's the difference between a solution architect, a domain architect, and an enterprise architect in details when it comes to the scope, the role, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I think if you were to describe these roles in a kind of like a generic way, you could say that the solution architect then focuses on complex applications or infrastructure elements. So for example, let's say a flagship application, such as a customer relationship management, a CRM application. Now, such an application often evolves over the years into a mix of legacy and modern components. And as a result, it has often become an extraordinarily complex environment. So then the solution architect's job would be to maintain the reliability of such flagship applications and ensuring that they remain cost-effective, user-friendly, secure, and whatnot. And the cloud and network architect roles that I referred to earlier are then specializations of the solution architect role. Now, if you look at the domain or the segment architect, I think that they are responsible for a specific area called a domain, an architect's domain, which is below the enterprise or organizational level. And in a large organization, for example, a domain or segment architect is, I think, typically responsible for everything related to that specific domain. So this could be the business domain, which then includes, of course, business capabilities, processes, business objects, or even the information domain, which includes information concepts. And enterprise architects are responsible for the entire organization-wide ecosystem, if you will. So in practice, an enterprise architect may specialize in a particular part of an organization. And this is usually the case when an organization has several enterprise architects on the payroll. Now, as I mentioned before, this organization may also choose to hire a chief architect, which would then be a specialization of the enterprise architect role. Now, of course, all these architecture roles are then part of the entire architecture capability.
That breakdown helps a lot, I believe. But of course, as you know, not every organization has the luxury of a fully staffed architecture team, if we can say that. Do you believe every organization needs all of these roles, or in other words, can these responsibilities be consolidated depending on size, the complexity of the organization, or the scope, or the context?
And it's another excellent question. And there is actually a lot of discussion about this, including within the architecture community. And I think the big question is which roles are truly necessary and which are less so. As I mentioned in my response to your first question, there is no one perfect way to organize architecture roles within an organization. Much depends on the organization's size, the maturity of the architecture capability, the industry in which the organization operates. And personally, I believe that every organization, regardless of its size or industry, should have at least one enterprise architect and one solution architect on staff, because this ensures that architecture is approached from an organization-wide perspective rather than just an IT perspective, which is still all too common today. Now, I think deploying architecture across your entire organization enables you to take a proactive approach based on this architectural perspective. And I think that this approach then covers the full breadth of everything your organization does and is involved in, allowing you to contribute ideas from the outset. However, if you only deploy a solution architect, as many organizations still do by means of an IT architect, then your architecture will be severely limited to a reactive attitude, as it will only be able to move along with the course of the organization instead of contributing ideas in a guiding manner. So cohesion between all these organizational and architectural domains is then lost because everything is viewed and acted upon from this single, mostly IT perspective. So I think in short, it is my belief that every organization, large or small, regardless of the industry, benefits from deploying at least one enterprise architect and one solution architect, at the very least?
I would say it depends on the context, the organization size, on the industry. But the most important thing is to identify the right role, what is needed, what is exactly needed from the enterprise architecture practice. Of course, this will be identified in the framework phase and all the aspects that we discussed in the previous episodes. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we'll get to that in one of the next episodes. It all depends on how the organization tries to position the architecture capability and what they expect from this architecture capability. And depending on how it is set up within an organization, that will give a clue as to which architecture roles will be necessary to perform the architecture capability.
Absolutely. And just to ground this a little bit more, can you share an example where a lack of clarity around architecture roles caused confusion in a project and how this can be resolved? Because I've seen this a lot. I've seen multiple hats. The solution architect plays the business architecture role, the technology, and so on and so forth. So do you think this is an issue or it is something that we have to deal with it?
Yeah, I think it is certainly an issue. I've worked for a lot of organizations here in the Netherlands, where I'm from, and it is all too common to hire an architect. Mostly the organization is looking for an enterprise architect, but in practice, you as this architect only operate within the confines of the IT department. So the whole perspective the organization has when it comes to architecture is based on an IT perspective. And I think they think that if they practice architecture on an enterprise-wide scale or level, from this IT perspective, that they are actually doing enterprise architecture, which is of course not the case, because enterprise architecture is something completely different than what an IT architect does. Enterprise architecture is far more complete way of practicing architecture than just from this IT perspective.
Now, let's shift the gear a little bit about something I would say very essential for any enterprise architect that is usually missed. Most practitioners concentrate more about understanding the knowledge, frameworks, models, and they miss a critical aspect, which is competencies. I always say that anyone can understand the framework, anyone can understand the knowledge in general, but there are some other aspects that cannot be taught in frameworks or books. So in your experience, what are the most essential competencies that an enterprise architect should develop to be effective in today's world, especially with the whole disruption around us?
Well, that is a good question. And let me try to answer this as best as I can, because opinions also differ on this one too. Mainly because in some cases, the role of the enterprise architect is still seen as a technical role. Now, fortunately, this is changing slowly, but it is changing. The more strategic nature of the role is becoming increasingly recognized, right? So this requires, of course, different competencies. However, very few architecture frameworks actually contain an overview of these competencies. So if you look at, for example, the TOGAF standard, it does not have this overview of competencies necessary for performing an enterprise architecture role. The framework only provides a list of required skills. Now, you may be asking yourself that what is the difference between a skill and the competency? Well, skills are specific learned abilities to perform this single task, such as, let's say, proficiency in architecture modeling. While competencies are broader and they encompass a combination of skills, knowledge, attitudes, behaviors that enable this overall success in a role or situation. So think of skills as the tools in toolbox and competencies as the ability to build something complex using those tools, along with the knowledge and planning that is involved with it. So I've compiled this overview of competencies that I consider to be the most essential. Now, as you can see on this slide here, there are 10 competencies which are plotted on the 3 core architecture roles that I mentioned before: the enterprise architect, the segment architect, and the solution architect. Now, you asked me specifically about the competencies for the enterprise architect role. And I think in that case, I would say that strategic thinking and vision are important, because this involves conceptualizing the long-term view of enterprise systems and aligning them with the organizational goals. But I also consider strategic decision-making to be of the utmost importance, as this involves making informed and strategic decisions, even in uncertain or complex scenarios. And then there is leadership and influence and change leadership, which are also vital, as is, of course, business and technology aligned. Well, you can see all the competencies listed here, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but let me just end with saying that I believe that, for example, communication and collaboration, adaptability and resilience, analytical thinking are all essential competencies for an enterprise architect.
I would add, being an effective enterprise architect doesn't just mean writing frameworks or understanding frameworks only. It means having a real impact on the strategic level, for example, a stakeholder engagement, which is very critical. But taking that into consideration, Eric, can you describe how an enterprise architect engages across both the strategic planning and at the same time concentrate on the operational implementation?
I think that enterprise architects act kind of like a bridge between an organization's long-term strategy on the one hand and its day-to-day execution on the other hand. And their work, an enterprise architect's work, spans both or two dimensions. So I think first there is this strategic plan. And at this level, the enterprise architect helps to ensure that business goals and capabilities and all kinds of organizational priorities remain aligned with each other. So this role involves collaborating with executives, business leaders, etc., to understand the organizational vision, regulatory drivers, market opportunities, and risks and whatnot. And enterprise architects are also actively involved in capability mapping. So defining and mapping business capabilities to determine where the organization needs to, let's say, invest in people, processes, technology, etc. And they design then target states for business, data, application, and technology domains to ensure scalability, interoperability, resilience. Then they engage in road mapping, setting principles, guardrails, etc. Now, this is all from the perspective of strategic planning, right? And the enterprise architect then operates as this strategic advisor, if you will, ensuring that leadership decisions are informed by architectural insight. Now, that's for the first dimension. The second dimension is from this more operational implementation perspective. And I want to zoom back in on the perspective of this strategic planning and then translate it to operational implementation. So if you look at the perspective of strategic planning again, the EA then translates strategy into actionable tasks and ensures that these delivery teams remain aligned with the organizational vision. Now, they also participate, and by they I mean the enterprise architects, in architecture review boards and change processes to ensure compliance, right, without stifling the information of innovation. So they communicate, let's say, architectural direction, patterns, best practices to these delivery teams and define KPIs. Now, from the perspective of operational implementation, the enterprise architect then operates as a delivery enabler and a quality guard, if you will, ensuring that the execution does not deviate from the strategy, though, that I was just talking about. So I think the real value of an enterprise architect, of that core architecture role, comes from the ability to translate business goals into architectural blueprints and implementation guidance, but also to balance this long-term strategic outcomes with short-term delivery realities, and to communicate effectively, not just to communicate, but doing it effectively with different audiences, including these executives, business stakeholders, and even technical teams. So enterprise architects then adapt this organizational roadmap based on the feedback from operational outcomes, such as shifting priorities, even emerging technologies, lessons learned. And in short, I think you could say that the enterprise architect is then responsible for defining where we're going and why, while still ensuring that how we get there is consistent, efficient, and most important, value-driven.
In other words, we can say that enterprise architect is connecting the dots between the strategy level with the operation.
Exactly, yeah, how we get there, yeah, while maintaining the answer to the question of why. Absolutely.
But there is the point here, Rick. I have also met a lot of professionals who are moving into the enterprise architect role after spending years in different domains. Some have a business analysis backgrounds, some are solution architecture, some in the IT leadership, and so on and so forth. What's your advice for someone transitioning into the enterprise architect role?
That's another good question, Omar. I think that moving into this enterprise architect role is, of course, a big leap, because unlike purely technical or solution-focused roles, EA work spans business, strategy, governance, technology. So there are quite a number of things to consider when it comes to this role. And I think that first, there is this shift from being a problem solver to becoming a navigator. Now, in the technical or solution roles, I think that success often means fixing or building something yourself, right? But as an enterprise architect, your value comes from framing problems, from guiding decisions, enabling others to build the right solutions. So I think it's best to try to think like, am I enabling the organization to make the right trade-offs, rather than am I solving this technical issue? And second, I think that you would need to develop this business first mindset. So you need to learn the business model. You need to learn the revenue streams, the value chain, the competitive landscape, map out the business capabilities, what the organization does, and understand which one are the strategic. And then partner up with business leaders, not just IT, business leaders, because credibility comes from showing that you understand the why, not just the how. And third, I think that you need to build strong communication and storytelling skills, because in my experience, executives don't want this deep technical detail. They want clarity on risks, on opportunities. They want trade-offs. Delivery teams want actionable direction and standards, rails, etc. It might be a good idea to practice tailoring your message, like boardroom language for executives, textual patterns for your peers, and practical guidance for the engineers. And there's a lot more to think about. My slide with the competencies demonstrated already, but let me end with the need to think in frameworks, but staying pragmatic. And that's important, like you mentioned at the start of this video series. Frameworks like the TOGAF standard or Zachman framework, or even SAFE's architecture practices can help structure your thinking, but you must not to become this framework purist. So you need to tailor your methods to the organization's culture, maturity, perhaps even the industry. And at the end of the day, becoming an enterprise architect requires this key mindset shift. You are no longer building systems. You are shaping how your organization evolves over time. And that's important to remember. And you can already see that shine through in the way the competencies are formed and phrased. It's all about this mindset and not about the technical skills. These technical skills are, of course, also linked to competencies, but they map to a different architecture role, a different core architecture role.
Here's where it gets more interesting, because everything we just talked about can look completely different depending on where you work. You mentioned in your book, Getting Started with Enterprise Architecture, that the role and the scope of architects vary greatly by organization, and we discussed some of that in this session. But can you elaborate more about what you mentioned in the book?
Yeah, as I said earlier, every organization is different, right? So the way an organization views and deals with architecture also varies. And this explains the varying views on how architecture can best be implemented and which roles are necessary, which are less so. Now, one organization, for example, may focus more on the IT side of the field, the profession, which carries the risk, of course, of only using architecture reactively. And then another organization may not yet recognize the benefits of involving an enterprise architect in translating strategy into implementation. And this is often because architecture is still considered to be a part of this IT department. I always try to demonstrate the value of enterprise architecture. So I avoid jargon and focus on showing that the added value the profession provides to an organization. Now, since I initially created an inventory of the organization, as I explained in my book using the Enterprise Architecture Implementation Wheel approach, I can quickly become involved in strategic discussions, because I can immediately translate the impact that a particular strategy will have, because I know what is going on within an organization. But to get back to your original question, how can beginning architects prepare for the various perspectives that exist? I think the most important thing is to have this clear idea of how you as an architect or starting architect want to establish yourself and your architecture capability within your organization. And this then combined with the organization's maturity level and the company's wishes, of course, will provide an overview of how architecture can be best practiced. And then it is up to you as the architect to determine if that aligns with your and the organizational goals.
Yeah, I think that clarifies a lot. And this will lead us to my next question. What are the main drivers behind how the architecture function should be shaped? I know that there is no a specific answer or a defined or a best practice that fit all, but at least there are some drivers or some concepts that we can take it into consideration.
I think there are, of course, various motivating factors that will determine how the architecture functional capability is set up in an organization. And many of these factors then relate back to, like I said before, to the, let's say, the industry in which the organization operates, or its business and its strategy, or even the existing landscape, like applications and technology, but also legislation, regulation, associated compliance requirements. And of course, there is this organization's operating model, the business canvas model, that largely determines how these issues are then addressed. And this operating model includes what an organization stands for, who its customers are, what its services are. And the architecture function capability plays a role in each of these areas.
Now, Eric, can you provide two contrasting examples of how EA was implemented in different contexts or different industries?
Yes, let's assume these two fictitious organizations, right? One being a bank and the other a digital scale-up company, which provides cloud services to its customers. So first the bank. Of course, this as being a bank is probably heavily regulated as far as the environment is concerned. It is a large multinational bank which operates across, let's say, 30 or even more countries. And they have this very strict regulatory oversight, a legacy technology footprint with mainframes, custom built trading platforms, even siloed data. And if you look at the enterprise architecture implementation, would then probably consist of this centralized enterprise architecture office located under the CEO or CIO. Of course, architecture review boards would then be required for all major change initiatives. And I think that there would be this program for core banking modernization, data lake implementation, and whatnot. So the core focus of enterprise architecture in this bank scenario, this fictitious bank scenario, would then be, I think, on risk reduction, compliance, consistency, etc. And then there is this digital first scale-up organization, which I think we can assume they are a fast-growing company. They are expanding globally. They are a heavy use of cloud services, open source tooling, but there is minimal regulatory pressure compared to the bank I was just talking about. If you would look at their EA implementation, there would not be this centralized enterprise architecture office. I think instead there would be segmental domain architects embedded within product teams, and these architects and senior engineers would then share architecture patterns, tools, even emerging practices. And the artifacts that they would create would probably be, as we call, a living documentation, like in wikis and code repositories. So enterprise architecture from the scale-up scenario would be seen as this kind of enabler, closely aligned with business agility. And I think there might even be some duplication of the effort, like multiple teams choosing overlapping tools and whatnot. But this would then be considered acceptable as a trade-off for speed and innovation. So I think the bank then prioritized control, risk reduction by using or focusing on the centralized governance-heavy enterprise architecture, and the scale-up, the digital first scale-up organization prioritized speed, flexibility, empowerment. And I think they would choose this more lightweight enterprise architecture, which would be embedded in delivery. So two different organizations and two very different approaches to enterprise architecture.
Yeah, thanks so much, Eric, for this insights. And this will bring us to the end of our session today. Once again, Thank you for these insights and examples that you provided today. It was very fruitful.
It was my absolute pleasure. Like I said before, I hope we created yet another insightful video for our viewers.
I hope that. And let's wrap up this episode of the EA Explained video series. Today we unpacked architecture roles, clarified responsibilities, and explored how these roles shift and stretch across different organizations. So I would say whether you are wearing multiple hats or building out an architecture team from scratch, this episode gives you the clarity to move forward. We'll see you in the next episode.